All right, so now I'm gonna formally kind of go through price controls, which will be the meat of the lecture. Um, and the idea of setting up that recap on why markets fail is that price controls might be one way in which you want to, the government or individuals within the government or democracy or whatever, some participants in the legal system would want to kind of step in and deviate from the market. And this is one of the deviations in the government's toolbox is they can set a price control. Typically, I think in real terms, price controls are more a political tool than anything else. Um, Usually the way that it works is like one particular lobbying industry wants to uh, set like a minimum price milk um, or you know there's a minimum price on cigarettes because there's political reasons for that, and on top of that there's taxes on cigarettes too. um, but the price controls can also serve the equity efficiency trade-off uh, topic, the or equity efficiency um, trade-off conundrum that you have where uh, for instance, like a minimum wage, you might want that's a price control on the supply of labor or the price of labor. So you might want to implement a minimum wage to increase overall equality in your economy because it might be the case that wages have been stagnant for a long period of time and um, they're not compensating the accurate amount of or not I shouldn't say the accurate, but they're not compensating for a average person's living expense or something like that. And there might be maybe market forces or maybe other political forces that are artificially suppressing the real the real wage or whatever. Or maybe it's just all market force, and maybe the equilibrium wage is just not livable for some people. So you might want to increase the minimum wage for that. But as I'll show you, there's also a trade-off for that. Or the trade-off is being it's still being debated in economics. It's a 25-year long debate. But in theory, there might be some trade-offs for that. Anyway, so that's the gist of a price control and why they might be in effect. So let's go through the formal definition. All right, so I start. Remember, market equilibrium is efficient if individuals and buyers and sellers cannot influence the price and there are no externalities. This is per the last bullet point. For now, assume that we are in an efficient equilibrium, i.e., we're at a market equilibrium that is Pareto efficient. We are in that. This is very hard for me to say the first time around. Okay. All right, so consider government intervention under these conditions. They might want to put a restriction on how high or low a market price can go because they might find that the market price is already too high or too low. Okay, and that's called a price control. On the other hand, you have quantity controls, which might be an upper limit on the quantity of a good that can be bought or sold. For this particular lecture, or for this particular course, I should say, we're going to talk almost exclusively about price controls. Quantity controls, while they exist, I think are just kind of like a mirror image of a price control, essentially. That every price control can be referred back to as a quantity control if you know the supply and demand functions. So I want to do price controls because I think because I think the minimum wage is the most important one, and that is a price control, not a quantity control. Quantity controls did have their moment, and they do for certain trade restrictions. But I think price controls is probably more relevant to your guys' life. So I wanted to do those, and if I do both, it'll take too long, essentially. All right, so I had to pick one. So I'm not going to test new quantity controls. I just want you to know that they exist. and they're just an upper limit on the quantity of good that can be bought or sold. Okay. So if you had a supply and demand function, where did my whiteboard go? Keeps disappearing. I know I didn't close it out, so. All right, so if you had a quantity, if you have quantity on the x, price on the y, and you have your supply and your demand, a quantity control is going to say, this is the amount of goods that can be bought or sold in the economy, and then we're going to have a different price for the consumer and producer, blah, blah, blah. You don't really know this just yet, but essentially you can do the same thing with a price control, and it's kind of easier to understand and everything. All right, so that's it. A quantity control is just a way of restricting the quantity that's sold, and there's going to be a surplus loss because you're going to have, if this triangle was your old total surplus, this will be your new total surplus, this little trapezoid. Yeah, and there's like a big case in the 80s where Reagan restricted inputs. He put a quota, which is another form of quantity control. He put a quantity control on the on trade with Japan, and the reason was that we were losing kind of labor-intensive industries to Japan. Name the cars. We were losing a lot of cars to Japan, and it was hurting the Detroit labor market, hurting people in the supply lines of Detroit. So we put on a quantity restriction, and it decreased our total surplus. We ended up paying extra taxes on that too. So Japan ended up benefiting a lot from that, but it might have slowed down the rate of job loss in Detroit at the time. I don't think it was a very effective policy, if I'm being straightforward. But that was just an example of quantity control. All right. Now that said, you can kind of forget about it. Sorry. You can forget about quantity controls because you won't really see them again. But there you go. That was my 2-minute spiel. So if the above conditions hold, if you're in a market equilibrium, then price and quantity controls both decrease total surplus. Okay, and they might increase consumer surplus, or they might increase producer surplus, but they're definitely going to decrease total surplus. So if they increase producer surplus, they're decreasing consumer surplus by more. Okay, but let's talk about them. Okay, so there are two types of quantity controls. The first is a price ceiling. Second is a price floor. A price ceiling is when there's a maximum price that sellers are allowed to charge for a good or a service. So if I bring in, come on. If I bring it, geez Louise. Wow, that was bad. I'm just going to ignore that one and just keep going. Let me up. Okay. So if I have my graph and what goes on the x-axis, guys, and I'm not using, I know I keep saying guys, I'm not using it in a gender term. I use guys for everybody, all genders. So excuse me if that's not a thing you're used to, but I don't mean to gender that phrase. Okay, so prices on the y-axis, quantities on the x-axis. Supply is upward sloping, demand is downward sloping, as always. And then let's say I put a price ceiling on. So a price ceiling is when there's a maximum price that sellers are allowed to charge for a good or a service. Okay, so imagine I have this line. Oh, that's bad. Again, idea. Okay, so imagine this. I want this big and bold. How do I make it big and bold? Boom. All right. So imagine the government said, a little bit smaller. All right. Imagine the government said that this is the maximum price you can charge for a good or service. This little orange line. You can't charge above this orange line. This is your ceiling. This is the max. You can't go above the ceiling. You try to touch the ceiling at your apartment or your condo or whatever, your house, right? You can't go above it. Okay. So price ceiling is the maximum price. The maximum price that you can charge for a particular good or service. Okay. For example, rent control. The government usually says, hey, in this particular market, you're not allowed to charge above, $1,000 for this for one bedroom apartment or something like that. It's pretty decent. That's a rent controlled apartment. There are still a few that exist in New York City, and I think they're trying to make them more pervasive. The reason being is it's going to increase consumer surplus for the people buying the rent controlled apartments at the expense of producer surplus. And it just kind of stabilizes the market a little bit because, apartment prices in New York City are kind of like really increasing very quickly, and maybe not necessarily worth it. Maybe not as much in the pandemic where people are moving towards rural areas, less dense areas. But the government might say, hey, if this right here is the equilibrium price, I'm going to draw it in red. If this is the equilibrium price, oof, that's ugly looking. I'll make it big. If this right here is the equilibrium price, P star, the government might say, oh, hey, you're not allowed to charge above this here, this little orange line. What does that do to the equilibrium price? It drops it down. You're not allowed to charge above the orange line, so the equilibrium price is now going to be, this right here, over here. Okay. So that would be like, let's say the equilibrium price for an apartment in New York City is $1,300 for a one bedroom. That's probably really low for New York City. The government says, okay, you're not allowed to charge below, or you're not allowed to charge above $1,200. That is a price ceiling. Okay. A price floor is when there's a minimum price that sellers are allowed to charge for a particular good or service. Okay. So the government might say you're not allowed to charge below $1,200. Why would the government do that for apartments? Your guess is as good as mine. But I know for the milk industry, because of basically lobbying, there's essentially a minimum price that stores are allowed to sell for milk. And the idea is that essentially consumers are subsidizing, milk, so that we have a higher, more pleased populace of dairy farmers. So the government sometimes will step in and say you're not allowed to prices below that. Another example will be cigarettes. There's some states have a minimum amount at which you can charge for a cigarette. The reason being is that the government sees cigarettes as having a negative externality, right? They increase healthcare costs on people, and when people have insurance, or if they don't have insurance and they're costs in the hospital, if you have negative health repercussions from smoking, you're costing essentially your fellow citizen. And you can argue that whatever. The point being that, or the secondhand smoke is also a negative externality. It's probably more straightforward negative externality. But there's a few negative externalities from smoking, such that the government wants to essentially restrict the quantity of people who smoke, and they can do so by charging a maximum price. So if this is the equilibrium price, the new maximum price, or I'm sorry, it's maximum, I mean minimum price. They'll set a price floor, so the government can only charge up to this point over here. Okay, so this will be your new equilibrium price right here. And what's that doing? It's decreasing the quantity of cigarettes bought so that only the highest willingness to pay people get them, and people who had some willingness to pay but aren't willing to pay up to here, like these people here, are buying less cigarettes. Okay, so it's decreasing the amount of cigarettes consumed by artificially increasing the price. And by doing so, you're decreasing the negative externality and kind of making the overall market more efficient. And I shouldn't say market, the overall citizenry more efficient. So that'll be an example of a price floor, a minimum price on milk or a minimum price on tobacco or cigarettes. Okay, so ceiling is the maximum price. And this should be really obvious. Maximum price is a ceiling, minimum price is the floor. I'm not going to, touch on my actual floor, but you can imagine that I'm touching my floor. This is the minimum price. It's the lowest I can go. Okay. All right, and then I'm going to stop this video after this slide, but these kind of all flow. There are two. So there's ceilings and floors. Okay. Within them, there are what's known as binding and non-binding ceilings and binding and non-binding floors. Okay. And before I even define them, okay. So if I say this is a floor, okay. So if this is a floor, right, and the floor is above the equilibrium price, it's what's called the binding floor. Okay, you're not allowed to charge below this point here, below this orange line. The equilibrium price says that you should be charging below the line, so you're actually, by law, restrained from charging this price. Okay, it's binding. The law matters. That's what it means to be binding. The law matters. The restriction matters. Because you're not allowed to charge below this price and you want to charge below this price, the law is going to take effect. If I set the price all the way down here, what happens? So if I say this is the lowest you can go, and you're charging $10, I'm saying you're not allowed to charge less than a quarter. You're going to charge $10, right? If I give you a floor, if I give you a law that says you're not allowed to charge people for milk below a quarter, and the price of milk is $10, well, you'd want to charge $10, right? The equilibrium price is 10. The floor says you can't go below 25 cents, but you're not going below 25 cents, then it doesn't matter. If they say you're not allowed below 10.25, then it does matter. So equilibrium price below the floor matters. Okay. Equilibrium price above the floor doesn't matter. Equilibrium price below the floor is binding. Equilibrium price above the floor is non-binding. Okay. And then there's another one here, which is ceiling. Okay. So the ceiling is the maximum price you can sell. So if I say you're not allowed to charge above 25 cents, you want to charge $10, well, guess what? You're charging 25 cents now. That is a binding ceiling. Okay. So if the equilibrium price is above the ceiling, it's binding. If the equilibrium price is below the ceiling, it's non-binding. If I say you're not allowed to charge above $100 and you're charging $10, guess what? You're still going to charge $10. Okay. So ceiling, if the equilibrium price is below, doesn't matter. If the equilibrium price is above, it does matter. Floor, if the equilibrium price is above, doesn't matter. if the equilibrium price is below, it does matter. And just to kind of, for the sake of the notes, non-binding. So I'm going to write them all out here. So I think it is helpful. Non-binding floor. I thought we could select. Just degraph them again. Oh, no, I want them black. Quantity, price, supply. Oof, that was an ugly S. So that's 2 down. And there's one more. Nope, there's 2 more. I'm sorry. Demand, supply, quantity, price. Make sure you label all your graphs all the time when you're doing graded work, at least. That's an ugly P. That's better. All right, and then we have P star. And we'll do it one more time. Demand, supply, price, quantity, star. Guess I didn't need the equilibrium quantity there. And then I want to select this bad boy twice. Okay, so now we have 4 scenarios. You can have a binding floor, non-binding floor, binding ceiling, non-binding ceiling. Let's start with the non-binding floor. So the floor is the lowest price you can set. So a floor doesn't matter if the lowest price you can set is below the equilibrium price. A floor does matter, so that's non-binding. So let's go to binding now. A floor does matter if the lowest price you can set is above the equilibrium price. Okay, so if I want to charge $10 for something, you say you're not allowed to charge below $10.25, then it's binding. Okay, what about ceiling? Okay, so there's a non-binding ceiling. So the ceiling is the max price that you can set for something. So the ceiling won't matter if the maximum price you can set for something is above what you're already setting for it. A ceiling does matter, so that's non-binding. A ceiling does matter, so it's binding if the max price you can set for something is below the price you want to set for it, the equilibrium price. Okay, so those are the 4 types of price controls right there. 4 types of price controls. Okay, so some price ceilings are known as binding, others non-binding. A non-binding ceiling ultimately has no effect on the price because equilibrium market price is already below the ceiling. Okay. Non-binding ceiling. Equilibrium market price is below the ceiling. Got it? Okay, sorry. All right, so equilibrium market price is below the ceiling. This is a nicer graph. And then a binding price ceiling has the effect of lowering the price. Actually, I'm going to stop here. Sorry.